I'd like to talk to you a little bit about Paul and the Corinthians and the Corinthian correspondence. One of the things that we can do when we study these texts is look for clues about the kinds of things that were going on between Paul and his communities. And like I've mentioned before, we're reading other people's mail, right? We're reading the Corinthians' mail, and we're trying to figure out, what the Corinthians thought about all of this. And so I just wanted to look for some clues here in the Corinthian correspondence to see whether we can plot out the relationship between Paul and the Corinthians. And so I'm just going to offer you a brief lecture on that today. First thing I think that we can point to, if you are reading through Corinthians carefully, you may have come upon this statement in Corinthians 5:9. And Paul says, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral persons. Now, this is a very funny statement, not because of the content, but because he says, I wrote to you in my letter. And if you look at the Greek, it's an aorist, it's in the past tense. This is not a past progressive. This is something that Paul is talking about in terms of his past. I wrote to you in my letter. Well, what letter is that? There's no, this is 1 Corinthians, right? Well, what scholars believe has happened is that Paul seems to have written the Corinthians a letter, and that letter has been lost to history, as so often cases happens. And this is, I think, what Paul is referring to. He wrote them a letter, and the letter perhaps got misplaced by the Corinthians, perhaps intentionally, perhaps not. But in any case, it did not get recorded for the rest of history. So really, that letter is lost. So I've broken this down. You see my notes here on the right-hand side. Letter A, between Paul and the Corinthians, is a lost letter. Okay, that's the first clue that we're going at. The second clue is that I believe all of 1 Corinthians is an entire letter written in one sitting. I don't see any evidence for cutting 1 Corinthians apart. And 1 Corinthians anyway, is an occasional letter. It is a letter dealing with issues. And you can see evidence for that at various places throughout 1 Corinthians. Let me start with chapter 1. Paul talks about, for it has been reported to me, in verse 11, for it has been reported to me by close people that there are quarrels among you, my brothers and sisters. He has heard some sort of report from Chloe's people. Now, what we're imagining is that Paul is writing from Ephesus. We know that from 1 Corinthians 16. And he's talking about Timothy, right, going to visit the Corinthians possibly. And he's also seen Apollos, and he's urged Apollos to go visit them. So there seems to be some kind of exchange between Paul and the Corinthians. So and he talks down here about the household of Stephanas and Fortunatus and Achaicus, who, he's talking here in verse, I rejoice at the coming of Stephanas and Fortunatus and Achaicus because they have made up for your absence, for they refresh my spirit as well as yours. So give recognition to such persons. So Stephanas and Fortunatus and Achaicus apparently have come from the Corinthians, and they have told Paul about what's going on in the congregation. And he talks about the household of Stephanas as being the first converts in Achaia. They devoted themselves. So put yourselves to the service of such people. Perhaps they're going back with Paul's answer. So he's heard reports from Stephanas and the other people who visited him, or maybe from Timothy, maybe from Apollos, but most likely from Stephanas. And he's responding then with this letter that we think someone is bringing, maybe Timothy, because he talks about Timothy needing their support, but it could be also, he says, put yourselves at the service of Stephanas, right? So it could be that he's talking about this guy going back with Fortunatus and Achaicus with his letter. So 1 Corinthians seems to be a letter from Ephesus in response to reports he's had, but it's also in response to another letter. And if you look at 1 Corinthians 7, he says, thou concerning the matters about which you wrote. So he's addressing issues that the Corinthians have asked him about. And he uses this clause, now concerning, again and again and again in the letter. You find it in 7:25. Well, let me get there. Right, now concerning virgins. You find it again in 8:1. Now concerning food sacrificed to idols. You find it again in 1 Corinthians 11:18. Oh, here's another report. I hear that there are divisions among you. That's the same report as in 1:11. And in 1 Corinthians 12:1, he says, now concerning spiritual gifts. Again, in 1 Corinthians 16:8. Again, that's sort of his talking about what has happened. He's also heard one other report. It is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you. I'll just let you read those verses on your own in 1 through 7. But in any case, what's going on here is that he's gotten a bunch of reports about divisions in the congregation, about issues in the congregation, and he's gotten a letter. So 1 Corinthians is basically his response to all of these issues. And it's sent by way of, perhaps Timothy, perhaps Fortunatus and Stephanas and Achaicus. So that's who gets it. Now, the hard thing is trying to figure out what to do with 2 Corinthians. When you turn to 2 Corinthians, one of the things that scholars have easily noticed is that it's a crazy letter. It really is. And you can really see clear divisions in the text. If you turn to 1 Corinthians 9:1 and you look at the preceding verses, there seems like there's a seam here. He's talking about at the end food. Here I am, and he's talking about the ministry to the saints right after he was commending Titus, and it seems like here in 23 and 24 of 2 Corinthians 8 with his commendation of Titus, really this whole section of 16 through 24 is something that you would expect at the end of a letter. It's like coming to a conclusion of a letter. And then he starts over here in 9:1 about having to write the Corinthians, or not having to write the Corinthians, about the collection that he's taken up of money for the saints in Judea. So there seems to be, it's really weird, he seems to end the letter and then he starts the letter again. And if you follow even more closely, chapter 10 is even more shocking. He talks about, I myself, Paul, appeal to you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ. I ask that when I am present, I need not show boldness by daring to oppose those who think we are acting according to human standards. Indeed, we live as human beings, but we do not wage war according to human standards, for the weapons of our warfare are not merely human. He's really attacking them. We wage war. We're going to wage war. We're attacking you. Right? If we look here at the end of chapter 9, he says, you will be enriched in every way by your great generosity, that you will produce thanksgiving to God through us. Through the testing of this ministry, you glorify God by your obedience to the confession of the gospel of Christ, and by the generosity of your sharing with them and with all others. Thanks be to God. He's so thankful to them. And then, here in 10, he just lets loose of them. What's wrong with Paul? Is he schizophrenic? Was he writing this letter over a period of days, and he falls asleep loving the Corinthians, and he wakes up the next morning and he just has a tirade? Or did he get some report in the middle while he was writing it? There's all kinds of speculation that you can make. I think probably the best explanation is that 2 Corinthians is a collection of letters. And the way that I imagine this, and the way that a lot of scholars imagine this, is that each of the congregations, they had their own little receipt book. And usually when the letter came in from Paul, they'd record it. But sometimes they didn't record them in the same order, and sometimes they may have taken off the precepts and the prescripts and the conclusions and everything else. And I think that's probably what he's doing here. I think he's probably engaging them, but saying, there's just something here I need to I totally lost the train of my thought. But this letter, 2 Corinthians, is probably made up of multiple letters. So let me look for evidence of that and what's going on. If we go back to 1 Corinthians 16:8, we have this evidence that Paul's going to stay in Pentecost, and he sent Timothy back, and he sent Stephanas and Fortunatus back to them. And Timothy has come back to Paul, and he is telling Paul that there seems to be some problems. And it just doesn't seem to be going well. So he's come back from Corinth after, Paul promises Timothy's coming, right, in verse 10. And he's come back to Ephesus, and he's told Paul that things are not going well, that his letter did not have the positive effect. And so Paul was wanting to go visit, and he did in fact go back and return to visit the people in Corinth, as he's planning here in verse 5. I will visit you, for I intend to pass through Macedonia, and perhaps I will stay with you and even spend the summer, right? So, I will stay with you even through the winter, so that you may send me on my way wherever I go. I don't want to see you just now in passing, for I hope to spend some time with you if the Lord permits. So he's going to go visit them a second time. He's talking about Timothy going to visit them, and Timothy's told him before his second visit that things are not going well. So he goes and he makes this visit. And let's look for a clue about how this visit went in 2 Corinthians 13. The visit did not go well. I warned those who sinned previously and all the others, and I warn them now while absent, as I did when present on my second visit. that if I have to come again, I will not be lenient. Since you desire proof that Christ is speaking in me, he's not weak in dealing with you, but is powerful in you. For he was crucified in weakness, but lives by the power of God. For we are weak in him, but in dealing with you, we will live with him by the power of God. So he's warning them. Now he came to visit them. That second visit did not go well. He's warning them. If he has to come again, he's not going to be lenient. Well, where else do we have evidence of that second visit? Let's take a look at here. Yeah, chapter 2, verse 1 in 2 Corinthians. I made up my mind not to make you another painful visit. Right? Apparently, this visit was not good. If anyone has caused pain, he's caused it to me. But to some extent, not to exaggerate, to all of you. This punishment by the majority is enough for such person. So now instead you should forgive and console him. So someone insulted him. Someone did something to Paul that was an affront. And Paul is asking that that person be forgiven. That second visit was a mess. It did not go well. So after the second visit, Paul goes back to Ephesus. And, well, what would you do after a visit like that? Well, you'd write a letter. You'd write a letter. And the contents of that letter were not pretty. So if you look at 2 Corinthians 7, even if I made you sorry with the letter that I wrote, I do not regret it. I rejoice because you were grieved, but because your grief led to repentance, not because you were grieved, but because your grief led to repentance, for you felt a godly grief, so that you were not harmed in any way by us. And this godly grief, Paul believes, is transformative godly grace, right? But in any case, Paul wrote them a really tough letter. Let's go back to 2 Corinthians 2, where he's talking about the event of that second visit. I made up my mind not to make you another painful visit, for if I caused you pain, who was there to make me glad but the one whom I pained? And as I wrote as I did, so that when I came, I might not suffer pain from those who should have made me rejoice, for I am confident about all of you that my joy will be joy. So he's also talking about this letter. And then here, verse 4, for I wrote you out of much distress and anguish of heart, and with many tears, not to cause you pain, but to let you know about the abundant love I have for you. Now, all of this is in the past tense. And it's in the beginning of 2 Corinthians. So, he's talking about this so-called letter of tears. The scholars call it the letter of tears. Well, where is it? Where is that letter of tears? Is it lost too? Just like that other lost letter? It can't be First Corinthians because he hasn't gone for that second visit. He's planning on coming again. But it can't be these verses. It can't be 2 Corinthians 1 through 8 because he's writing in the past tense. To me, the only logical conclusion is that the letter of tears is 2 Corinthians 10 through 13. You with me now? So letter C is 2 Corinthians 10 through 13. That's the letter of tears. That is this sad letter that Paul writes after his painful second visit. So you could fill this out. You could put here first letter, or first visit, and then the lost letter. Paul's in Ephesus, writes 1 Corinthians, second visit, goes badly. And then, as a response to this second visit, he just can't visit them again. He's just so mad that he writes 2 Corinthians 10 through 13, and it is a letter of tremendous anger. And it has a positive effect. As we read in these verses, especially in the verses we were just looking at in chapter 7 of 2 Corinthians. He's talking about this rejoice. Even if I made you sorry with my letter, I do not regret it. For see what earnestness this godly grief has produced in you, what eagerness to clear yourselves, what indignation, what alarm, what longing, what zeal, what punishment. At every point you have proved yourselves guiltless in this matter. So although I wrote to you as if it was no account on the one who did the wrong, nor on account of the one who was wrong, but in order for your zeal for us might be known to you before God. In this we find comfort. In addition to our own consolation, we rejoice still more at the joy of Titus, because his mind has been set at rest by all of you. So he ends up chapter 7 with tremendous warmth, and then feels warm enough in chapter 8 to commend Titus and even ask the Corinthians to send him money. And really, the tone in chapter 1 through 8 of 2 Corinthians is very warm. It is one of friendliness. He has this great thanksgiving after his affliction, and then he talks about the postponement of his visit, and then how they should be forgiving. And then you have these beautiful texts about the ministry of the new covenant, the clay jars, and probably my personal favorite, this text on the ministry of reconciliation in 2 Corinthians 5. Wonderful, beautiful stuff. It's a warm letter. So after the letter of tears, I like to think of 2 Corinthians 8 as a letter of reconciliation. And then 2 Corinthians 9, 1 through 15, I view as another letter about the collection, probably a random letter about the collection, because he's already talked about chapter 8, about the collection he's making for the saints in Jerusalem. Chapter 9 might have been just another letter that was circulating in the region of Achaia to all the churches, probably was just attached here. And here's what I think happened with this correspondence. You know, the Corinthians have their receipt book. Maybe they were embarrassed by the letter that was lost, the first letter from Paul, because it was about some, improprieties that they didn't want to necessarily, air to the rest of the world, the dirty laundry, right? But then they write down 1 Corinthians in their receipt book. But after the second letter, it goes so poorly, and the second visit, and then that letter of tears comes in, and they've set it aside until they can change. And then they rejoice upon the letter of reconciliation that they find from Paul. And so they write that into their receipt book. And that's how things, I think, probably got mixed around. They put the letter of tears aside for a while. When they get this beautiful letter, chapters 1 through 8 of 2 Corinthians, they put that in their receipt book. They add another collection book. And then finally they say, even though this letter causes much grief, it was painful, we need to write it down. It was important. So that's how I would reconstruct the Corinthian correspondence. I think that's how I explain, in terms of time, how this works, by looking at the clues and the relationship. Different scholars have different ways of doing this. Some German scholars have divided the letters of 1 Corinthians into as many as 5 or more. 2 Corinthians into as many as 5 or more epistolary fragments, and 1 Corinthians into more than that, or 2 or 3. So some of these scholars go hog wild cutting the letters apart. I don't. I'm giving you maybe 5 that I see for both of these letters total. Or some scholars might say 8 or 10. The main thing that I want you to keep in mind is that the letters that we have for the Corinthians probably do not reflect necessarily the actual correspondence, but they reflect the actual correspondence, but not necessarily in the order that it was done. Okay? Well, anyway, this was kind of our little investigation into Pauline, the correspondence between Paul and the 2 Corinthians. I know it's, I'm just going to go ahead and end the lecture now. I hope it wasn't too confusing, but you can listen to it again if it really was. All right? Thank you.